So former Minister Pravin Gordhan has been honoured for his contribution in the fight for the betterment of South Africa. Gordhan died last week after a battle with cancer. His comrades are remembering him for his great leadership and selflessness. Today, his body will be at his Pretoria home for viewing, and a memorial service is expected to be held at the Johannesburg City Hall this afternoon. The editor of the City Press, Mondli Makhanya, now joins us to look at the life of Pravin Gordhan and the legacy that he leaves behind. Mondli, very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making time for us. How would you, from the perspective of a journalist that has covered the work that has been done by Pravin Gordhan, characterize the legacy that he leaves behind?
Well, I would divide Gordhan's legacy into three. I think there's the struggle Pravin Gordhan, the person who dedicated his life very selflessly to the liberation of South Africa from the early 1970s. Right up until 1990, when he was arrested as part of Operation Vula, being detained, basically not having a life, and being an activist fighting for South Africa during that particular period, and that was his life. So the struggle Pravin Gordhan is that Pravin Gordhan, and then there's a Pravin Gordhan who then went into government and did an amazing job of creating institutions such as SARS, which today we know is a world-class institution that is looked upon by many similar organizations in the world as a model for revenue collection. And then obviously as finance minister. And then there's the Pravin Gordhan, who basically was the person who fought against state capture, who stood up to Jacob Zuma when very few people in the leadership of the ANC were able to stand up to Jacob Zuma and fight against the leadership of the ANC at that particular point. And that, I think, is the Gordhan that has been celebrated much more in the past few weeks, in the past few days since his passing. Because that's the Pravin Gordhan that basically kind of like, he was that sentinel. I mean, like the person who stood between the thieves wanting to raid the National Treasury. And basically in the National Treasury, he guarded South Africa. We could have been in a much worse space than we are today. We know that that basically what happened at Eskom, what happened at Transnet, what happened at many of the SOEs, when the Guptas, in conjunction with Jacob Zuma, were doing the worst to the South African fiscus. Then he became the personification of the fight against state capture. So I think that is a legacy, and you know, we recognize somebody kind of like, I think, at the very end, rightfully so. I think that kind of like that we were on the precipice of something worse that could have happened to this country, and I think we have Pravin Gordhan and many others, obviously, to thank for that.
Yeah. Before we go into some of the roles that he played in cabinet, I just quickly want to speak to the relationship that he had with the former president, Jacob Zuma. So the former president would have been the first president to appoint Pravin Gordhan as a minister. This is after his tenure at SARS. He became the Minister of Finance. Later on, he became the Cocta Minister and then the Minister of Public Enterprises. How should we characterize that particular relationship? Because it's a relationship that starts before the dawn of democracy, that then carries through into the democratic state and eventually into the executive.
It is a very interesting relationship. You're absolutely correct. Because the relationship goes back to the ANC underground. Jacob Zuma is in exile. He's part of the military. He's part of Umkhonto we Sizwe, and is running a lot of the operations of the ANC underground in South Africa. And Pravin Gordhan is a member of the ANC underground inside the country. And that's where the relationship begins. And this goes back to the 1980s. And then Pravin Gordhan becomes one of the people who establishes something called Operation Vula. And Operation Vula was like an attempt by the ANC to establish a vast network of underground cells in South Africa in preparation for a people's war, which would have been the final onslaught, military onslaught against the apartheid regime. And Pravin Gordhan was pivotal in establishing that particular operation. And Jacob Zuma in exile, along with Ronald Kasrils and Mek Maharaj and others, were the kind of like the bigger national leaders behind Operation Vula. And that's where the relationship began. And it continued into democratic South Africa. And so when Pravin Gordhan, when Jacob Zuma becomes president, he trusts Pravin Gordhan and he appoints him. Obviously, he's a tried and tested person at SARS. He's turned SARS around. And so in 2009, Jacob Zuma becomes president, and he appoints Pravin Gordhan as finance minister. And in Zuma's warped head, Pravin Gordhan was supposed to do his bidding. And he actually thought that Pravin Gordhan was going to go into the Treasury and basically turn the Treasury into his kitty. Pravin Gordhan resisted that. And that's when the big fallout began, because Pravin Gordhan saw his role in the same way that he had seen his role in the struggle, basically serving the South African people, serving the Republic. And he was not going to be somebody's servant in Treasury. So he basically fought against he resisted a lot of the instincts that Jacob Zuma wanted him to exhibit at that particular point. And in 2014, Jacob Zuma then replaced him. He turfed him and made him Minister of COGTA, which is also an important role. It was not a small role, but he did not want him in Treasury. And then, obviously, and he's to tell us now that he put in Nhlanhla Nene, thinking Nhlanhla Nene would also do his bidding. Nhlanhla Nene said, no, I'm also not going to do his bidding. Fires Nhlanhla Nene in December 2015. And then he's forced to bring back Gordhan. And that's when, obviously, the big fallout happened, because Pravin Gordhan, back at Finance Ministry, then was the person who then became a much bigger and bolder in the face of Jacob Zuma trying to capture the Treasury.
Yeah, and speaking about that period when Pravin Gordhan was in Treasury, this is now looking at his first stint. This is after leaving SARS. I remember the story of Oupa Magashule. I don't know if you still recall Oupa Magashule, who was who was actually his successor at SARS, and Oupa Magashule was later on fired. When I had a conversation with Johan van Lochenberg, a former SARS official, related, of course, to the spy tapes saga, he said in that interview with me that he believes that Oupa Magashule became the first victim of a state capture, considering how that played out. And I wonder whether Pravin Gordhan would have been alive to what was happening, because we know what happened after Oupa Magashule left. You had Moyane, who came in as the SARS commissioner, and the history is there for all to read, including the SARS, including the commissioner's report into what happened at SARS under Moyane. But for me, Johan van Lochenberg speaking about Oupa Magashule being the first victim of state capture, why do you think perhaps maybe a Pravin Gordhan wouldn't have been aware of what is currently playing out, or what would be the start of the so-called state capture?
No, I think he definitely would have been aware, because as finance minister, SARS reports into the finance ministry. So he was definitely aware, and they were working together. And I think that Magashule would have been would have been somebody that the president would have consulted Pravin Gordhan about basically appointing this person and would have trusted him, and they actually did have a solid relationship. Then if you go back to the rogue unit story, and it is said that the rogue unit basically that Magashule was also in the crosshairs of those who created the myth of the rogue unit, and so the two of them basically kind of like the person who founded our modern day SARS and the person who inherited the modern day SARS would have been working hand in hand at that particular point in trying to resist the capture of SARS by the Zuma lot. And then the terrible way in which Magashule also leaves is that he is then bugged. His phone is bugged and he's recorded doing things that, yes, he should not have been doing, but those were personal things in his own personal space. But it was a way of getting rid of him, and the role that is played by allies, business allies of Jacob Zuma in the bagging and ouster of Magashule was also something that basically kind of like is, Van Lochengabe is correct. He was the first victim of state capture because he had to be gotten rid of from SARS in order to repurpose SARS for the purposes of the corrupt and criminal.
Yeah. You also speak about that period, of course, that he would popularly become almost the personification of the fight against state capture. And I think about what would have then happened, because surely that is a brave stance that somebody like a Pravin Gordhan, who's a member of the executive, would have taken, that when you look at the ANC's elective conference, he didn't come back as an NEC member. So why is it that the rank and file of the ANC didn't express confidence in Pravin Gordhan coming back as an NEC member of the ANC? And this is now speaking during the period of the now president of the ANC, that is Cyril Ramaphosa. So Cyril Ramaphosa is already the president of the ANC. The ANC goes into its elective conference, but the rank and file of the ANC do not express the confidence that seemingly is publicized on Pravin Gordhan. Why do you think that's the case?
Okay, before I answer the last bit, can I quickly segue into saying that one of the disappointing things about our current president is that, you have people like Pravin Gordhan, you have people like Mcebisi Jonas, people like Mavuso Msimang, people, and it's not just that those few individuals. There were many other people in the ANC who stood up to what was going wrong, who stood up to Jacob Zuma at that particular point. Cyril Ramaphosa was very quiet, and he was conspicuous by his absence. At that particular point, he was Jacob Zuma's deputy, and he is one person who did not stand up to Jacob Zuma. All those people took personal risks, serious personal risks, not just career risks, but also security risks, in order to stand up to what was happening at that particular point, because Jacob Zuma also controlled, he had a secret unit based at the SSA and obviously, and then kind of like in the rest of the security infrastructure, and then kind of like, and also ran militias in the country. But also, but like the fact that Jacob Zuma did not have the courage of people like Pravin Gordhan, and that the Cyril Ramaphosa did not have the courage of people like Pravin Gordhan, is basically, I think for me, is the greatest disappointment, because I think the state capture could have been fought more effectively if the deputy president of the ANC and the deputy president of the country could have stood up to what was happening at a particular point. But and then like to your question about why Pravin Gordhan did not actually kind of like become kind of like, was not recognized by the broad membership of the ANC as somebody who should be celebrated and kind of like and retained and thrust to office. And I think that has to do with the fact that, like the ANC has, like since 2007, had become a very populist organization. You have to be populist in order to rise in the ANC these days, and you have to say things that kind of like that please people, kind of like, and I will give you sweets, I will give you ice cream, I'll do this for you. And Pravin Gordhan was not that person. Then secondly, also, I think kind of like then there was the racialization of the ANC. And people, like Pravin Gordhan in the 1980s was one of those people who basically was one of the people as organizer of the NIC, the Natal Indian Congress, and in the Transvaal, you had something called the TIC, the Transvaal Indian Congress, basically went out and told Indian people that you are not Indian, you are black. And people like Trevor Manuel and Cheryl Carolus and all those people were also organizing the colored community, saying that you are black. And black is basically colored, and it's Indian, it's African. But then in the past kind of like 10 years or so, you've had people kind of like characterizing people like Pravin Gordhan as Indian. We have a re-racialization of the ANC losing its non-racial character. And you'll see today on the NEC of the ANC, there are very few people who are not African. And they've actually had to co-opt people like Barbara Creasy, onto the NEC in order to give the NEC a non-racial character. So you've had that people basically ANC basically becoming an African organization as opposed to a non-racial organization. So I think that like he became a victim of that, and then you've had very crass characterization again, basically from organizations such as the EFF, very ahistorical characterization of Pravin Gordhan as an Indian, and basically branding him a racist, when actually he was one of those people who were at the forefront of creating a non-racial character to the liberation movement, and then a non-racial character to the constitutional republic that we have today.
Mondli Makhanya, thank you so much for your time. That is the editor-in-chief at the City Press.